Good afternoon. This is Sean Golding with Golding & Golding, here to discuss the basics of who has to file a tax return in the first place, right? Are you a U.S. person, individual for income tax purposes? Important about this discussion is that we're only dealing with individuals. The IRS uses the term U.S. person, which obviously most people would presume that just includes individuals, but it's not true. U.S. entities, trusts, things like that have their own tax return filing requirements, 1041s and 1120s and all that good stuff. The purpose of this presentation is simply to discuss individuals who may have to file a tax return and some of the basics. So let's get started. A U.S. person for tax purposes is typically three main categories. One, it could be a U.S. citizen, either by birth or naturalization, a lawful permanent resident, or a foreign national who meets the substantial presence test. Now, the substantial presence test is a counting days test. So maybe you're on a B1, B2 tourist visa, H1B work, L1 transfer, EB5 investment. Depending on the number, and you don't even have to be on a visa, but most of the time you're on a visa. Depending on how many days you spend in the current year, in addition to the 2 prior years, will determine whether you meet this test. If you do, you have to file just like you're a U.S. person or lawful permanent resident. It's a counting days catch-all test, and it's absurd. So when do you have to file? What needs to be filed? Typically, the due date is April 15th to file your 1040 tax return. As a U.S. person individual, you file a Form 1040. That's your main form. You may have several other forms and schedules to file, but that's the main form that you file. Like I said, it's generally April 15th. It can sometimes fall on a different day depending on if the 15th is a Saturday or Sunday. If you live overseas, you qualify as a foreign resident, U.S. expats that are living abroad, then they generally have a 2-month extension until June 15th. You don't have to do anything for that extension. Either one of the two latter categories can file an extension until October 15th. It's an automatic extension. You can file a Form 4868. There are some other ways to obtain the extension as well, depending on what state you're in. Sometimes there's an automatic extension like California. And then there's a December 15th extension for some taxpayers, typically abroad, who fall into certain categories. There's no specific form that needs to be filed, and it's not guaranteed or automatic like the other extension, but something to consider. 1040 is to report your worldwide income when you're a U.S. person. So U.S. person individual, U.S. person individual is required to file a Form 1040 to report their worldwide income. They can live overseas. All the income may be sourced from overseas, but they still have to file a Form 1040. Now, they may have already paid tax overseas, and in that case, they could file a Form 1116 to claim foreign tax credits. They may be able to file a Form 2555 if they qualify for the foreign earned income exclusion. So it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to pay U.S. tax on all of the foreign income. It just means you have to include it in the return. Now, another thing to consider is for the Form 2555, it excludes up to $120,000 worth of income per person per year, in addition to a housing exclusion. But oftentimes taxpayers will come to us and say something like, I didn't file a tax return because I make $100,000, let's say. And then the idea is the U.S. government still requires you to file the tax return and the 2555 so you can claim the exclusion. Just saying, I'm below the exclusion amount, so I don't need to file, that doesn't work. And it's become a bigger problem lately with the IRS, U.S. government pursuing passport denials and revocations. So if you're a U.S. citizen, you have one passport, you live overseas, you haven't filed because you thought you're under the exclusion, and you have a substantial, significant tax liability, you could end up having your passport revoked or denied when you try to go in to renew it. Now, in addition to filing the tax return, there's various international information reporting forms or foreign tax reporting forms taxpayers have to file. Some of the common ones are Form 3520. That's for if you received a foreign gift, trust distribution, or a gift from an individual or an entity. 3520A is for U.S. owners of foreign trusts. 8621 is for PFICs, passive foreign investment companies, but don't let the name fool you. It could be as simple as owning foreign mutual funds and ETFs. Form 8938 is for FATCA, 5471 is for foreign corporations, and 8621 was duplicated on my sheet, so I apologize. That's for PFICs. Can you avoid being a U.S. person for tax purposes? And the answer is maybe. Let's say all of your income is sourced from overseas. Maybe you're in a country that doesn't have a high tax rate, so by having to file a U.S. tax return and include your worldwide income, you could be setting yourself up for a significant tax liability. So first, if you are a U.S. person because you met the substantial presence test, you're not a U.S. citizen, you're not a lawful permanent resident, then you may qualify for the closer connection exception. If you can show that you have a closer connection with a foreign country or foreign countries, then you may be able to avoid having to file the 1040. Instead, you file the 1040 and are non-resident, and you only report your U.S. sourced income. There's also 8843, depending on if there's a medical situation, if you have certain positions, certain jobs in the U.S., you may qualify. For permanent residents, especially, they may qualify for a treaty election to be treated as a foreign person for tax purposes if they reside in a treaty country and they meet the qualifications. That requires filing Form 1040-NR along with the 8833. F1 visa holders who are here for the first 5 years may also qualify to not be treated as a U.S. person. There's a lot of traps and pitfalls to be aware of. We have a separate article on that issue. So oftentimes what will happen is someone comes here on an F1, maybe they were here for 4 years, they left, they came back on another F1, they're here for another 4 years. The clock doesn't restart every time, so that's something important to note. As I mentioned, the treaty election is Form 1040-NR with an 8833. Substantial presence test, closer connection exception, or other exceptions is typically 1040-NR along with the Form 8840, 8843. If you're realizing you're a U.S. person for the first time, this is very common for taxpayers who may have been on a visa and then started to apply their 485 for a green card, or they're applying for citizenship and you realize you're out of compliance. Take a step back, take a deep breath. It's probably not that bad, but there's plenty of things you could do to safely get into compliance. Some practitioners may recommend a quiet disclosure. We never do, because if you get caught doing a quiet disclosure, the ramifications could be very serious, and far more serious than if you had just entered into one of these programs. So if you're willful, you would do the voluntary disclosure program. There's not many ways around that. If you're non-willful, there's plenty of options available to you. There are the streamlined filing compliance procedures, domestic or foreign, depending on what's your country of residence. There are the delinquency procedures, delinquent FBAR, if all you have is FBAR, delinquent international information return submission procedures if you have more than that. The FBAR one all but guarantees a penalty waiver. The other program, let's call it delinquency procedures, as of November 2020, they no longer guarantee the penalty waiver. We have a ton of free information available on our main website and our sub-website. You can always reach out and schedule a reduced fee initial consultation if it's appropriate to your matter and it's something that we handle here. Again, my name is Sean Golding with Golding & Golding. Thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.